When it comes to the legal case against Shannon Sharpe, we have some new developments for you. From more responses, both from his attorney, his former co-host, to another former NFL player, to Sharpe making a surprise visit. A lot to talk about as the former NFL star and commentator faces serious allegations of rape and sexual assault that have led to his departure at ESPN. This time, we bring on sports attorney Dan Lust to break it all down. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. NFL Hall of Famer, podcaster, sports analyst Shannon Sharpe has been in the news quite a bit this last week, and as updates come in, we have been covering it here too on Sidebar. Now, we know that a Nevada woman filed a $50 million lawsuit against him on April 20th, claiming that he raped her twice in October of 2024 and once in January of 2025. And the sexual assault allegations are incredibly disturbing, that this purportedly happened while she was crying and begging for him to stop. This unidentified Jane Doe also claims that he recorded her without her consent, that he shared those videos with others, that he even threatened her. And I'm going to get into a new response that we haven't even talked about yet in just a minute, but it wasn't just the lawsuit that was shocking. No, it was also the events that transpired afterwards. Because what happens? Sharpe released a statement on his Instagram.
To my family, friends, supporters, and colleagues, I want to speak to you directly and from the heart. This is a shakedown.
And he claims that Jane Doe's attorney, Tony Buzbee, is targeting black men because we know that Tony Buzbee previously sued Sean Combs, Jay-Z, Deshaun Watson, claims that he believes that her side is going to release a 30-second clip of a sex tape, and apparently he encouraged them, just release the whole thing, provide the whole context. Apparently, he revealed her name and also the name that she goes by when she purportedly uses or presents on OnlyFans. And overall, he and his team have been adamant that everything that happened between the two of them was consensual. And to prove that, his side released a plethora of text messages seemingly between Sharpe and this Jane Doe. For example, as reported by TMZ, there's one apparent message from October 2023 where Jane Doe seemingly messages Sharpe, "I want you to put a dog collar around my neck and choke me with it while you're bleeping me." Okay, you fill in the blank. The NY Post reporting on other messages allegedly from Jane Doe, like, "Tie me up and do bad things to me." Now, Buzbee responded and said that these messages are from before the alleged assaults, and really a woman can say yes 99 times, but that one time she says no, that's all that matters. And in that vein, by the way, an audio clip was released by Tony Buzbee, or seemingly by him and his side, capturing the voice of a woman whom attorneys identify as the woman suing Shannon Sharpe, telling him not to manipulate her. And then you hear a man's voice, resembling Shannon Sharpe's, can be heard saying, "If you say that word one more time, I'm gonna bleep and choke the bleep out of you when I see you." And the woman, allegedly Jane Doe in this case, then can be heard saying she does not want that, while the voice resembling Shannon Sharpe responds, "Yes, you do. I don't think you have a choice in the matter." Then Shannon Sharpe, and we talked about this on a previous Sidebar, decided to temporarily step away from his job at ESPN's First Take. And Sharpe's statement that was posted to his Instagram account on April 24th says in part, quote, "The relationship in question was 100% consensual. At this juncture, I am electing to step aside temporarily from my ESPN duties. I will be devoting this time to my family and responding and dealing with false and disruptive allegations against me. I plan to return to ESPN at the start of the NFL preseason." A lot of money at stake in this case. And by the way, talking money, actually talking about how to get money back, let me tell you real quick about Upside, our amazing partner and sponsor. So Upside is great. It is a free app that gets you cash back when you buy daily essentials. I pump my gas, I can use Upside. I go out to lunch, I can use Upside. Maybe I get something at a convenience store, I can use Upside. And why not get cash back when I do all these things, right? And yes, this is actual real cash back. It's money that appears in your Upside app that you transfer right into your bank account. So once you have the free Upside app, you claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside. You pay as usual using a debit or credit card. You follow the steps on the app, you get paid. So to find out how much you can earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on screen. But make sure to use our promo code SIDEBAR because you'll get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. And following Sharpe's departure, ESPN released a statement of its own. A spokesperson for the sports conglomerate writing, "This is a serious situation and we agree with Shannon's decision to step away." But it was reported from outlets like Us Weekly that just hours later, Sharpe showed up at the NFL draft in Wisconsin and recorded an episode of his Nightcap podcast with Chad Ochocinco Johnson. Although they didn't talk anything about the allegations, it was interesting he made that appearance. Now, we have some more statements and responses that we haven't gotten into previously on other episodes of Sidebar, but we're going to get into now. But before we do that, I want to bring on Dan Lust, sports attorney, host of the Conduct Detrimental podcast, and professor at New York Law School. Dan, so good to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Jesse, good to see you as well. The story, as you would expect, is front page news in our world. So certainly happy to break it down with you.
I know. When it broke, we wanted you on immediately. We haven't talked about it. Your overall thoughts on everything that I laid out so far, and we'll get into more specifics. I know we're going to get into a little bit about what Stephen A. Smith had to say, because we presented a little bit of his response in our last episode, but he has a much fuller response that we'll get into. So putting Stephen A. Smith to the side, just your overall thoughts on what you're seeing here.
Yeah, so this is a dynamic story involving a sports media personality, and we're seeing the case litigated through the media. So every day we have something new. And as I think you and I kind of exchanged some thoughts briefly last week, this was an evolving story, and I figured there would be an update this week, and obviously it's still somewhat unfolding. But, on big picture, we have Tony Buzbee, who is no stranger to high-profile cases involving, people in the sports and entertainment realm. And then we have, I guess, a character from the past, Lanny Davis, the attorney for Shannon Sharpe. Anytime you see kind of two high-profile lawyers on either side, I start kind of dissecting the lawyer beats in the conversation. So a lot to unpack, and certainly no shortage of legal tactics in the media to kind of look at here.
I said this before, I'll say it again. It feels like the Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni strategy. Litigate this in the media, right? Especially when you have a high-profile individual like this, because you're not only battling this in the court of law, you're battling this in the court of public opinion. I'm not saying you should do this, but what I think is we're seeing is if you put enough out there, it could create a situation where Jane Doe might drop her suit. If people start siding with Shannon Sharpe, if he presents text messages, it's getting quite ugly before there's some sort of protective order or gag order put in place by the court. What do you make of this strategy to litigate this for everyone to see?
This is the weird part. And I'll also add to that, like, there's a little bit coming from here, a little bit coming from here. And if you kind of create a circus about a story, maybe it loses its underlying heart and the sensitivity of the nature of the allegation. So I think that's a little bit what's going on. From a substantive perspective, and I know you alluded to it, right? There's I think it's a minute-ish clip, purportedly a phone call between Shannon Sharpe and his accuser. And there are, we'll say, and this is kind of the first domino, right? It's not a graphic video in terms of, it's not a video. It's actually just a phone call, and we're talking about some things. Put it this way, I don't want to make this kind of step in it, but you can say things on a phone call that will be two things that two adults are legally allowed to consent to with one another, right? There's nothing wrong with that. That initial phone call that went out, yes, it was somewhat graphic in its nature, but there's nothing really criminal that occurred on that phone call. So the next step that Shannon Sharpe's side took was basically to release, I think, a much more extensive array of text messages that also carried within the same theme of graphic messaging. Again, maybe not necessarily illegal, but things that consenting adults could consent to, right? There's no issue with this. You and I have talked on a previous episode about Trevor Bauer and those allegations with where someone was allegedly rendered unconscious, where legally you're not allowed to consent to that type of an act. So you asked me what my thoughts were on the strategy of litigating this. I don't really quite understand the strategic nature of releasing more things. Like Tony Buzbee's side allegedly released this a minute audio clip. The text messages are more of the same, none of which are criminal, but we understand, right? I think as a viewing public, we can understand there is some consent that happened to this, but you're not really litigating the case in the media, so to speak, by offering text messages that don't show consent of the underlying act of sexual assault that's here. So yes, it's just, to me, that move was really just muddying the waters, and we can certainly get into what I view as other confusing signals. We'll put it that way.
They're saying it was all role playing, right? The idea of what he said on that, or allegedly said on that audio tape, is another example of role playing, and that she agreed to all of it. And they're trying to gray up a lot of this. And, it's interesting because, and we'll get into this a little bit later, about the idea that he potentially offered her a $10 million settlement before she filed. Now, some people would say, if you offer that settlement, you're hiding something, right? You're guilty as sin. The other people say, I don't want this coming out. This is embarrassing for me. I mean, this is my personal, private, intimate life. I don't want any of this coming out. $10 million? What does that say to you?
I have some strong thoughts there, and this is where I was kind of getting to, so I'm happy you took us there. It's just mixed signals, right? You can't have a statement that basically dares someone to release the video. Release the full video, not the unedited. Release everything. We want this to be out there for everyone to see. We want it to be litigated above board. Let's get this all out. And at the same time say, well, I want to pay $10 million. And again, that's an admission from Shannon Sharpe's lawyer. That's not from Tony Buzbee and the other side. That's Shannon Sharpe's lawyer saying they're trying to extort us for a lot of money. Yes, we can all agree that's sometimes the playbook. that there's some type of extortion that occurs. I'll put in quotes because it's not really an extortion to have a lawful negotiation back and forth. But to offer 10 million tells you that there's something in the case that they don't want to go out. So I don't know how you offer 10 million, which is not a nuisance level settlement. That's a giant number, right? 10 million, and then say we want everything to come out. We're totally fine with this, the truth being out there. Those two things are not consistent with one another in what is a general legal playbook for litigating things in the media.
By the way, what did you make of him showing up to the draft?
I think he's just basically saying, business as usual, right? Like, I'm just going to show up. I was looking this morning to see if he's put podcasts out. Club Shay Shay is still alive and well. It's his own podcast. He's putting it out on YouTube, but I think ESPN, has somewhat distanced himself from the distribution, but he's putting it out there, right? And I think from his perspective, he's saying preponderance of the evidence is on the plaintiff. I can do whatever I'm doing right now. And he, as if this new media world where he has his own independent podcast, Disney/ESPN can't control distribution of a podcast, right? Like, I have my own podcast, like, even God forbid I lose my job at my law firm, I can still put my podcast out. There's no relation to it. But showing up at the draft with those level of NFL credentials is a different move. And recording a podcast with Chad Johnson, aka Chad Ochocinco, is, I think, another move. Just say business as usual. We're going to keep moving. But the problem, Jesse, and this is to the larger point where I have an issue with what Shannon Sharpe did, there is no onus. You don't have to put all of those text messages out. You don't have to admit that a $10 million offer was made. But once you put those things out, ESPN can, I think, take the position, which Fox Sports did for a period of time in their, I don't want to say similar, but another sexual assault allegation that occurred at work, sexual harassment. Fox Sports took the position, we don't know enough. This is just a complaint. We don't know enough from our side. We're going to conduct an internal investigation. But Shannon Sharpe's side really pressed the accelerator on this case. And they themselves put out a lot of details, which I think tend to make Sharpe look worse. So once you put your accelerator on your defense, I think ESPN is certainly free to say there's just too much out in the media from both sides. We have to part ways at this point.
Let me, and he says he wasn't fired, he stepped away. And let me add to that, because now I want to go to Stephen A. Smith. We talked about Stephen A. Smith. This is Shannon Sharpe's co-host on First Take. We talked about him in a previous sidebar, but there was a lot more comments that he made. And I want to get into it. So this was on Smith's YouTube show. And he said the following: "Do I believe that Shannon Sharpe is guilty of what he's been accused of? Absolutely not. That's my personal opinion. The brother that I've come to know, I don't believe would assault or rape anybody. And I'm going to state that emphatically. But just as emphatically, I'm going to remind everybody it is my opinion because of what I feel about him, and not in any way imply that I know a damn thing beyond that, because I don't know. I'll always be here for him if he needs me. Just the same way I said that about Skip Bayless when he departed from Fox. Just the same way that I would say about any of my friends. That's what friends do, even in the toughest of times. Sometimes, especially the toughest of times. They ain't telling you you're right all the time. And hell, sometimes they may not stop you from falling into that abyss, but they're there to lift you up when nobody else will." He added, "When the news came down that he and ESPN had mutually agreed that he would need to come off the airwaves of ESPN, it was a blow. A blow to the show, a blow to me personally, because I'm going to miss him. But it was not a surprise. I've been at Disney since October of 2003. I know this place. I know the worldwide leader that is ESPN." And he added that he took a break from ESPN beginning in 2009. "They didn't need any definitive evidence at this particular moment in time about all that stuff. Once all the things Shannon Sharpe's lawyer put out there, it was uncomfortable to listen to. And it was not something that Walt Disney wants associated with its brand. So to have him on the airwaves while all that stuff was put out, that was not something that Disney was going to take. This is what I mean when I say I'm not surprised. It wasn't difficult for me to figure out what was transpiring. ESPN and Disney have a wait-and-see attitude when it comes to whatever evidence they may learn about this entire situation involving Shannon Sharpe from a civil perspective. That's all I have to say, other than I hope he's back in this business real soon on linear television, talking some football, because that man knows his football, and he certainly knows how to entertain us. While he's talking about football, I'm going to miss him." So, Dan, a lot of things here. But I got to say, I don't know if I necessarily disagree with Stephen A. Smith. I mean, Disney does not want that, what he said, even if it was 100% consensual. It's not fair, but, this is not a court of law. This is a business. Does Walt Disney want their host saying these things, or allegedly saying these things in text messages and a phone call? And it makes me wonder, is Stephen A. Smith right? And how on earth could Shannon Sharpe ever come back to ESPN?
So there's one thing, and I'll answer the question, but there's one thing in Stephen A. Smith's statement that I told you that I think is somewhat telling, right? Stephen A. Smith is friends with Shannon Sharpe. They've talked about this. It's very clear and evident from their statement that they're friends. Stephen A. Smith, in the statement that you read, I'm happy we got it out there, right? They didn't need definitive evidence, talking about ESPN, once all the things Shannon Sharpe's lawyer put out there. So Stephen A. Smith is pointing the finger at the lawyer. And then later on, I think in that episode, I believe Stephen A. Smith said that Lanny Davis, while not referring to him directly, seemingly as we're talking about him, said he was, quote, not being impressive in this at all. So Stephen A. Smith seems to blame the lawyer's comments for taking this to the next level. So, that's, and Jesse and I'll toot our own horn a little bit. If a client called us and said, how do we deal with this? You and I, having some sensitivity for the media, would say, like, listen, there is a way to litigate this through the media, putting this all up, but you're definitely jeopardizing your status at Disney. Right? This is not Fox Sports, right? This is Disney, which is Mickey Mouse, right? PG-13. I don't think you can get away with having those consensual texts, which definitely rise to a level of provocative nature, even if they're between consenting adults. So do I think Shannon Sharpe can move on from this in his career? Yes, I do, because he has his own independent platform, which, I think at one point had a $400 million valuation. They were talking about the Shannon Sharpe Podcast Network. He brings on a ton of guests. So do I think he'll have a career? Yes. Do I think he'll have a career at Disney? That's a very different story. And Shannon Sharpe is admitting to these acts, which, again, might not be illegal, right? And I'm talking about the acts between the text message and consenting adults, but the optics of that are really bad, right? And it doesn't have to be a crime that was committed by Shannon Sharpe, but he's admitting to the nature of the text. And Jesse, you read them about dog collars and whatever else. And if Disney doesn't want to have that on their brand, they don't have to. So I'm not sure that Shannon Sharpe ever appears on ESPN again. Certainly, he could have a lucrative career working for any number of other football networks, but that's the nature of the beast. And if you were Shannon Sharpe's side, you've put your finger on the pulse. You want to put all of this out in the media, and there are ramifications to doing that. So, I just hope Shannon Sharpe was advised of that properly. But from Stephen A. Smith's perspective, he's pointing the finger at the lawyer, which you never want to be the subject of the story.
It's an interesting point. You hope that they're on the same page moving forward, but I hear you. It's a good point. Okay, I want your reaction to this. So there's another statement. This is a new statement from Shannon Sharpe's litigation counsel, Mitchell Schuster. So one of the things that he addressed is why Sharpe would be willing to pay $10 million, this settlement, to Jane Doe before she filed the suit, saying when she learned that he would not father a child with her, she resorted to extortion. While Shannon was willing to pay her a substantial amount of money to avoid the intimate details of his personal life from being exposed, as many high-profile individuals often do when they're being threatened. Dan, first, let me start there. Thoughts on that?
I think it's funny that another lawyer is now giving statements trying to do some CYA for the first lawyer. That's my perspective. But yeah, I mean,
that's fair. That's fair.
I'm just a different lawyer. Usually you don't have two different lawyers within 72 hours giving statements in the case. Someone takes the reins. So I think our friend Stephen A. Smith gave us some hints here. But yes, yeah, statement's interesting. But yes, keep going. All good.
Okay, so there's another part where Schuster also explained that Sharpe intends to pursue claims against, meaning Jane Doe, and all who have assisted her with the dissemination of her fabricated story. And this is interesting, right? Does that mean he's going to file a lawsuit for defamation against her? Because I don't know how that works. There's a litigation privilege, right? Somebody can file. Every lawsuit, the other side's going to say is not true. It's all lies. You can't just turn around and file a defamation lawsuit. You have to have the ability to present your claims. What could he sue for?
It's not that different. And I think Shannon Sharpe referenced this in his Instagram post probably at some point last week. But he said Tony Busby is the same lawyer that went after, Jay-Z. And that lawsuit was later dropped. And I think, if memory serves, I believe Jay-Z is going after Tony Busby, the lawyer behind that case, for putting that case out. The underlying case was dropped, but I believe Jay-Z is pursuing a defamation case against Tony Busby in connection with that.
And extortion too, yeah.
Extortion, right. So it depends, again, what state we're based in. But if you wanted to tell me, not defamation, right, but if a video is doctored, right, you're not really necessarily protected by the judicial privilege if you are manufacturing and faking a video, which seemingly was the allegation from Sharpe's side. So, you could always defend it and say litigation privilege. We filed this lawsuit ahead of time. We're certainly protected. But it's not going to stop someone from suing and maybe applying the same pressure tactics that Shannon Sharpe's side was accusing Tony Busby of in the first sense, right? You might have some exposure, and maybe your malpractice carrier has some money they want to pony up instead of litigating the case in the court system. So you certainly could do that, but it's not the first and certainly won't be the last defendant to fire back and say these claims are defamatory. I'm being extorted, and I'm going to sue you, right? And maybe not via a counterclaim, but via a separate action. That's certainly possible.
And we have just a couple that. Marcellus Wiley, also a former NFL player, reacted to this lawsuit Sunday during an episode of Dat Dude TV on YouTube, saying his, quote, spidey senses were tingling when he heard about the filing. He said, something just ain't right with the timing of the settlement offer, the allegations, and even the temporary leave of absence. Either Shannon got played or we, us, you and me, are getting played as well. Did she know that that deal was happening or she didn't know? Because on Friday it was reported and on Sunday she filed. What happened between Friday and Sunday? Dan, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think what Marcellus is alluding to, there had been some reports of a very lucrative deal that Shannon's podcast network was being acquired. I think the number was, again, floated around 400 million. So if you're asking me why 10 million was offered, right, and obviously you and I are joking about Mitchell Schuster's second statement seeming to try to explain why Davis was talking about the 10 million off in the first place. If you stand to make $400 million, certainly $10 million is a drop in the bucket with respect to $400 million. And if you could pay 10 and then you net out 390, maybe you pay 10. Maybe that makes sense. That's the type of cost benefit settlement that we talk about. You know, I'm not aware that we were that close to a statute of limitations, and I could be wrong. But filing on a Sunday is somewhat odd. Filing on a Sunday tells you want to get the media for that entire week. And let's not kid ourselves. Last week was the NFL draft. It's the middle of the NFL offseason. Usually if you file on a Sunday during the NFL season, people are talking about football. They're talking about Sunday night football. They're talking about Monday night football. This is the dead time with respect to NFL media. So when you file on Sunday and there's no football activities until the draft on Thursday, you're winning the war in the headlines for those dates. So I think Marcellus is probably right that there is some gamesmanship there. And I do think this was related to the impending deal that Shannon was about to sign. Now, I had the thought, Jesse, this morning, do we think Tony Busby is happy that Shannon Sharpe put his foot on the accelerator and sped up this case in the court of public opinion by releasing those texts? The answer to that is probably no, because there's less that Tony Busby can now leverage Sharpe with, because now Sharpe seemingly is, I guess, a temporary free agent, whatever you want to call it, who's temporarily off the air, whatever they're phrasing it as. There's not that much more leverage that Busby could do, because every day he could say, listen, they'll take you off the air tomorrow if I put this out. They'll take you off the air the next day. And that leverage is now gone. It's not to say that the case is going to be any different, but I'm sure Busby was licking his chops at the ability to threaten the release of this video over time. But now he doesn't have that anymore. There's seemingly less bullets in the trigger.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's just been like a week, because it really feels like we accelerated and we heard so much. I want one final point. So Sharpe's attorney, again, Mr. Schuster, addressed something else in Jane Doe's lawsuit. So in Jane Doe's lawsuit, there was a reference to another lawsuit filed against Shannon Sharpe by a woman named Michelle Evans back in 2023, and it's still ongoing. She's suing for a variety of claims, including defamation, for Shannon Sharpe allegedly sexually assaulting her. And in fact, there was a reiteration of one of the same allegations as Jane Doe in this current lawsuit. For example, Evans' lawsuit claimed that Sharpe told her during a sexual assault that he would, quote, make it so no other man would want me. And in fact, in Jane Doe's lawsuit, it reads, Sharpe would repeatedly tell Doe that he wanted to do things to her that would make no other man want her. Okay, so take it that way you will. But according to a sworn affidavit from Shannon Sharpe, he denies the allegations from Michelle Evans that she laid out against him, says it was actually Evans who manipulated and threatened him, says that she was harassing him via text messages and phone calls. Well, again, his attorney, Mr. Schuster, has made a comment on that too. Quote, this is exactly what is happening to Shannon Sharpe, and the resurrection of the case involving Michelle Evans is a perfect example. Sadly, Miss Evans became obsessed with Shannon and decided to manufacture a claim against him. When she could not find a lawyer to pursue her outrageous story, she filed a civil complaint on her own that is completely devoid of merit, and basically that's because we believe she's representing herself. Quote, bottom line, Shannon has done nothing wrong and intends to fight back against these malicious lies, not with manufactured defenses or imaginary stories, but with documentary proof and real evidence. So Dan, we have a situation here where now you have two separate claims, right? And some would say strength and evidence, right? It's coming together against Shannon Sharpe. Or he's on the defensive and says, this is just another example. It keeps happening to me and I'm innocent. What do you take away from the inclusion of Michelle Evans here?
See, this is why I'm happy you brought me on the show. I mean, I spent probably 2 years, I was going to say litigating, but covering this case as if I was litigating myself, the Deshaun Watson case where Tony Busby was the plaintiff's lawyer. So there were, I think about 26 civil complaints that were filed. And you and I as the lawyers, I'm like, okay, I understand what's happening here and we'll break it down for the viewers, right? Tony Busby represented essentially 25 of 26 plaintiffs in that case. So a lot of non-lawyers would look and say, wow, these complaints have so much in common. It's basically the same exact thing. There's this common nucleus. It's this pattern. And all these women, some are from different states, from different employers. How are these complaints so similar? And I teach at New York Law School. I do these kind of conversations a lot. And I said, well, same firm, You're basically being asked to draft the same complaint over and over. So a lot of cut and paste jobs that are happening here. So I just want to point that out as a decision point in Tony Buzbee's history. We've had it, and again, I don't blame Tony Buzbee. There's nothing wrong with copying and pasting a lot of the same versions of the complaint and putting it out. But the outside public viewed that as being a pattern. Now, does it make sense for Tony Buzbee to look at other allegations that are out in the public realm against Shannon Sharpe that may or may not be out there, right? You're doing your research. Maybe it's not public. Maybe you're kind of going through the grapevines. You're talking to people in and around the space. It's possible, right? Just think about it practically. If an ex-girlfriend will know about the history of people that Shannon Sharpe has been with, maybe they've had these conversations. So I don't view it as being definitive one way or the other, put it that way. I don't view it as being a pattern. I am someone that really staunchly believes the plaintiff has the preponderance of the evidence. They have to prove their case. So I do think, yes, it's interesting. But again, in the sports and entertainment realm, this happens a lot, right? We could talk about Deshaun Watson, right? 5 people came forward and all of a sudden we had 26. That, to me, as a human being that speaks common sense, that's probably not the best sign if you're Deshaun Watson, but it happens a lot. Justin Tucker, the kicker for the Baltimore Ravens, it happened with Trevor Bauer, even P. Diddy, it's happening with. So other people to come out after the fact doesn't always show a pattern, right? These could be 10, 15 years apart from one another, maybe just different things happening at the same time. Jesse, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't point out, right? We're talking about a football case, a sports media case. I still think it is very telling, and I mean this sincerely. I'm not intending to joke about it. Mitchell Schuster has now taken over control as the public narrative and the public face of the media side of Shannon Sharpe's defense. That's almost unheard of for one lawyer, Lanny Davis, a high-profile lawyer who was very involved in some political lawsuits. People can feel free to look that up. But another lawyer has superseded control, and you have Stephen A. Smith basically blaming the first lawyer for why his friend might be getting in trouble from ESPN. Obviously, we know what happens. So I would read very closely the difference between these two statements. And I do think it's just not something I would have done. And again, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Every lawyer has different strategies. But putting out a $10 million offer was made looks really bad in the court of public opinion. If you have nothing to hide, release the video. We have nothing to hide, but we'll also pay you $10 million. I can make sense of it from a cost-benefit perspective.
Sure.
And I can also make sense of Tony Buzbee saying it, right, and breaching the confidences of a settlement conversation. Again, not that it's okay, but I understand it.
For him to be,
I really don't understand Sharpe's side doing it, and I really do think that's the reason he's not at ESPN right now.
And both in the discussion we had today and the discussion I did in the last episode, that settlement offer, the news of that has made a lot of people look at this very differently. And so I can hear exactly what you're saying. Interesting. Okay, let's see who responds next, because I'm sure this is not the end of the responses and who we're going to hear responses from. Dan Luss, thank you so much for coming on. It was great seeing you. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.